Hi, and thank you for joining this seminar on Wellness, a Professional Responsibility, a presentation on an attorney's ethical obligation for self-care and focused well-being that we teach within our Professional Responsibility course at Penn Law. I'm Jen Leonard, Associate Dean for Professional Engagement. My job is to provide law students with the professional skills they will need to thrive in our profession. I'm joined today by my Penn Law colleague, John Hollway, who has a cross appointment as a senior fellow at Penn's Positive Psychology Center. John and I designed this seminar by fusing our respective interests in preparing law students for our profession and on educating developing lawyers about principles of applied positive psychology. As you know, attorney and law student well-being has been a topic of significant discussion in recent years. And John and I, and others at Penn Law, have been working with our students and with practicing attorneys on how to take the unavoidable stress that we all have as part of our lives and channel that more productively. We're excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of the scientific literature on how to thrive and design rewarding lives within the practice of law, and how to optimize our responses to the challenges of legal practices in ways that will help us in both our professional and personal lives. It probably makes sense to introduce ourselves in a little more detail as we get started, so that you have some context for how we came to focus on these issues. As I noted, I serve as the Associate Dean for Professional Engagement here at Penn Law, and have spent the last 6 years developing programming and working with law students and alumni to equip them with the skills and behaviors that will allow them to thrive in practice. I'm also a graduate of Penn Law. Before I returned to assume my current role, I spent 10 years in practice, both as a litigation associate with a private law firm and as Chief of Staff to the City of Philadelphia Law Department. I had the privilege, just after graduating law school, to clerk for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. While I was with the court, I served as my justice's liaison to the attorney disciplinary docket. That role gave me the interesting opportunity at the very start of my legal career to see firsthand some of the behaviors that led attorneys to trouble. And, in fact, many of the challenges I saw in those proceedings related in some way to poor lawyer well-being, including substance abuse and dependency, burnout, disengagement, and more serious mental health challenges. In addition to that, though, maybe the most relevant for this module, as a law student and as a practicing attorney, I personally struggled with anxiety and depression for many of the reasons we'll discuss during this session. From these different experiences, and from learning more about the roots of stress and helpful ways to respond, I became passionate about helping new law students prepare for the challenge of a rigorous but very rewarding profession. I'm honored to have the opportunity to further those efforts through this online program.
Thanks, Jen. For my part, I've practiced law in a firm and for a variety of companies for almost 20 years, and then came back to Penn Law to lead the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice, a criminal justice reform research and policy center where we collaborate with criminal justice agencies to improve quality by learning from cases where things go wrong, wrongful convictions, officer-involved shootings, deaths in custody, etc. In that context, I began researching how to help people deal effectively with the psychological after effects of these professionally traumatic events and how to learn from them to improve the quality of the system and try and extract positives from these undesired occurrences. At the same time, I'm a father who works on a college campus, and I was becoming aware of the intense stress that our teenagers and college and law students are living with and the negative impacts that can have. And my wife, who leads a law firm, was confronting the reality that lawyers as an industry are suffering from high levels of depression, anxiety, loneliness, disengagement, substance abuse, and other challenges, all of which can be truly life-threatening. So I realized I needed to learn more about this, and I went back to school. I got a master's degree in applied positive psychology from Penn and joined Penn's Positive Psychology Center as a senior fellow. I've been working since that time to bring the scientific principles and exercises of positive psychology that have been shown to enhance behavioral health to the law school and the university at large. Jen and I have been designing programs that enhance psychological well-being and improve lawyer and law student engagement since that time. So today's module has 4 main goals. 1, we want to raise awareness of some of the well-being challenges that the legal profession faces. 2, we want to discuss some of the possible causes for those trends. 3, we want to connect our collective well-being as attorneys with the ethical obligations that we owe to our clients. And finally, we want to introduce law students to the science of well-being. With respect to the well-being portion of our module, we're going to focus on 3 main topics: optimizing your mental and physical responses to stress, improving your mental vocabulary towards realistic optimism, and enhancing your resilience, your ability to bounce back more quickly from the inevitable curveballs that life will throw your way.
We're going to talk a lot about well-being today. And well-being, or wellness, are words that get thrown out a lot in conversations about the practice of law. So it probably makes sense to start by agreeing on a framework for thinking about well-being and being clear on how work and the practice of law and stress fit into that. This picture comes from the National Task Force on Lawyer Well-Being, which released a report in 2017 on the state of wellness in our profession and made a number of recommendations on ways that lawyers, law firms, and law schools could improve the lives of those who practice law. Since its release, the ABA has endorsed the report and the recommendations contained in it, one of which is to incorporate a module like this one, focusing on attorney well-being as part of our ethical obligation to our clients, into every upper-level professional responsibility course. The point of this picture is that well-being is not something that comes in silos. Instead, it develops when we consider and embrace all of the various spheres of our lives. At different times of our lives, different spheres of our existence take center stage, but they all work together to provide a picture of our whole selves. As lawyers, our focus will naturally be on occupational well-being. Are we happy in our jobs and feeling engaged and rewarded? We've chosen careers that might be high on intellectual stimulation, but maybe lower, for example, in spiritual or physical stimulation. So what does that mean for our overall well-being? And how do we differ in our experience of each element as individuals? So, for example, you might be a varsity athlete. For you, physical well-being is likely to be more pronounced. And you might focus more on the emotional components of well-being than is commonly focused on in an office setting. Meanwhile, the student next to you might be particularly committed to her spiritual development, but not as focused on physical stimulation. Your experiences, therefore, are different and individualized. Being aware of how you experience each factor is the key to greater awareness of how you might enhance your own well-being. The idea is just that as you think of designing a life for yourself in which you're flourishing, keep in mind these various spheres of our lives that we try to keep in balance, and recognize that occupational, the sphere related to your job, is only one of those. When we talk about well-being then, we're talking about the process of finding the right balance for each of us across all of these spheres. Understanding how your occupation fits with the rest of your life, how the rest of your life can complement your work, is what will be important for this conversation.
Now, as lawyers, we're natural fixers and problem solvers, and we often look for things that are wrong rather than look at things that are going well. Not surprisingly, a lot of the focus on well-being in law schools has been on helping students in crisis. Obviously, that's really important, and it probably makes sense to say very clearly at the outset that because neither Jen nor I are mental health professionals, this seminar is not focused on responding to crisis situations that require the assistance of a clinical or medical professional. At the end of the seminar, we will list some organizations that do support students and peers who might be in need of mental health treatment. We strongly encourage you and your peers to turn to these resources if necessary. One resource to turn to see if clinical assistance is necessary is Endurus, and the link to that is on the slide you're looking at right now. At the same time, it's important that we not think about well-being as the opposite of crisis. When we talk about well-being today, we're not talking about suicide prevention and substance abuse treatment programs. Instead, for purposes of today's discussion, let's think about well-being not as a binary crisis or non-crisis situation. In reality, most of us spend the vast majority of our time, we hope, not in crisis. So instead of thinking of wellness as a 0 or 1, a well or unwell choice, let's think about wellness on a spectrum between -10, which is crisis mode, and +10, a situation where we're thriving or flourishing, where, like Emmett in the Lego movie, everything is awesome. On this spectrum, most of us probably spend the majority of our time in a situation where things are basically good, but there are things we're bothered by, hurdles or stresses, competing concerns in these different spheres of our life. My job might be great, but I'm struggling with finances, or my romantic relationship might be challenging, or maybe I have a great relationship with my kids, but I'm not that fulfilled at work. Or maybe my job and home life are both great, but I have aging parents who need constant care, and that's an overhang on my feelings of well-being. All of this is just real life. unavoidable, everyday, imperfect life. So when we talk about well-being, we're not just talking about getting people out of crisis. We're talking about tools we can use and steps we can take when we're in a relatively healthy state that will help us bring ourselves closer to that everything is awesome condition. This way, when the inevitable curveballs of life come our way, maybe we lose a case, or we have a personal setback, or our favorite sports team loses an important game, we've done some preventative maintenance and we've built up some resilience. When those setbacks happen, we want to make sure we don't slide from like -3 to -9, but instead that we're going from 2 to only -2 or -3, and then we can climb back more easily and more rapidly to those positive numbers. So let's make a couple of observations about well-being that might be self-evident, but I think are worth being clear on up front. First, well-being or thriving is not the same as incessant happiness. It doesn't mean you're happy all the time. When we talk about thriving or flourishing in our lives, we're talking about something broader and deeper than just happiness or joy. In fact, if you're pursuing joy all the time, what the Greeks or Aristotle might call hedonic pleasure, you're probably partying pretty hard and you might be neglecting some things of substance in your life. Instead, Aristotle thought that thriving and flourishing actually came from a balanced life, a life well lived, what he called eudaimonia. Literally, eudaimonia means a good inner spirit or a good genius, and it's much more nuanced than happiness. When we enroll in law school or we pursue a career in the law, we want ourselves to be happy not just in the ecstatic joy sense, but in the fulfilled, energized with a sense of purpose and meaning way. So that includes positive emotions, but it's a deeper meaning of happy. And for true fulfillment, we need to also include the other phases of our lives beyond occupational well-being. We want to have it all, that balance and fullness in our lives. It's not just joy. So remember that positive well-being doesn't mean you're joyful all the time.
The second thing to keep in mind is that while financial well-being is definitely part of our overall well-being, there's a lot more to flourishing than money. As this study and many others like it have repeatedly shown, income and happiness don't have a linear relationship. Instead, there's a diminishing marginal return to income, a level at which another dollar won't buy you any more happiness. Now, money makes a lot of things easier, to be sure, but not all of those things will get you to a life of fulfillment and personal meaning. And this can be harder to remember in a profession that ranks law firms based on profits per equity partner, or focuses on salaries as indicator of prestige, or the size of civil verdicts or settlements as the indicator of attorney success. So, if your approach to personal thriving is, I'm just going to make more money, that will only get you so far. And then you'll have to circle back to these other phases of life and figure out what makes sense for you. At the same time, for many attorneys, the inability to sustain a healthful financial life is a real issue. Studies show that lawyers working in the public interest, for example, generally experience higher levels of job satisfaction, particularly in the junior years of practice, than their private sector counterparts. At the same time, rising debt levels and stagnant salaries can make those jobs just as stressful, albeit for different reasons, than the highest paying private sector positions. Vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue are two other stressors that are particularly pronounced for lawyers working with vulnerable populations. And for small and solo practices, the increasing pressure to develop clients and generate business to sustain the practice increases the level of stress. So, financial and overall well-being for lawyers is complex and can contribute to much of the broader stress the profession experiences. At the same time, beyond a certain point, more money will not solve the general well-being issues we face as a profession. If it would, we would see a pronounced increase in happiness among lawyers in the most highly paid private sector positions, and we know that's not the case.
So if there's more to flourishing than earning a lot of money, and I think that intuitively we all know that's the case, how do we go about designing a career within the law where we earn enough money to live a style that we want, while also finding a sense of meaningful and impactful work and feeling like we're good at what we do? First, it's important that we understand ourselves. This slide shows data gathered by Larry Richards, a psychologist who specializes in the psychology of attorneys. It turns out that as a whole, lawyers are more likely to have certain psychological characteristics that might make them terrific lawyers and provide great client service, but they need to be understood and used in moderation. Usually when we show this slide, we get nods throughout the room at one or more of these characteristics. This is the results of a psychological characteristics survey using the caliper profile that Dr. Richards did of over 1,000 attorneys, and he compared them to, humans. Lawyers have a higher degree of skepticism than non-lawyers, which is not surprising given that our job is to anticipate and identify risks. We have higher degrees of urgency, and we like to get things done quickly. And we tend to value autonomy more than non-lawyers, so we really prefer to just be left alone and trusted to get our work done. And we've got a job. That job is a big focus for us. We want to complete that task as quickly as possible. On a related note, we tend to be a little bit less sociable than non-attorneys as a whole, and we tend more towards perfectionism and away from resilience, the ability to bounce back from a setback. When you take things on your own shoulders, it makes sense that you'd be more rattled by mistakes or bad luck. When you look at these characteristics as a whole, it becomes a little bit easier to understand why a Harvard Business Review study identified law as the loneliest profession in America, and why rates of substance abuse, depression, and suicide are higher within the practice of law than in many other professions. People who are naturally more skeptical, less sociable, more autonomous, have a higher degree of urgency, and struggle to cope with mistakes are going to be great at focusing on risks and getting lots of work done at a high level by themselves. They also might be more likely to accept too much responsibility for the success of work initiatives and struggle more when imperfections or setbacks happen. And they might lack social networks that could provide them with necessary help along the way, or choose not to engage with those social networks when they need to. Without this help, their autonomy and urgency might drive them too deeply into their work, making them candidates for burnout, and they might turn to unproductive outlets like substance abuse to cope with the mounting pressures. We see this happening today even to people who have achieved great success in the profession. Senior partners at terrific firms and other lawyer leaders, people who are household names in our professions, have come public with their struggles, and these are people who've succeeded at every level of their careers to an outlandish extent.
At the beginning of this seminar, we said that well-being and thriving were not 0 or 1, and it isn't. But when you're in crisis, when you're feeling burned out, it's just not possible for you to do your best work for your clients. The best version of you is one that gets energy from your work, not one that approaches each day with a sense of dread. In fact, in a study of 650 practicing lawyers in Tennessee, respondents reported that a lack of commitment, energy, or engagement was the largest factor in ineffective legal representations. Not making mistakes, not cutting corners, not unethical behavior, but instead factors that relate directly to our own health and well-being. When we aren't engaged, when we're depressed or lonely, we can't do our best work. We can't give our clients the sort of zealous representation to which they are entitled. What that means is that we have a professional responsibility for self-care. We have to ensure that we're doing what we can to move ourselves to the right on our well-being spectrum. It's like the in-flight instructions we get when we're getting ready to fly. We have to put the oxygen mask over our own mouths before we turn to help others. If we don't, we risk being unable to help anyone. Not our clients, not our families, not ourselves. In fact, we've already recognized this as a professional responsibility, though we might not have been quite as explicit about it as I just was. The model rules of professional responsibility state in Rule 1.1 that, quote, lawyers owe a duty of competence to their clients, and that we must act, quote, with reasonable diligence and promptness, end quote, in representing our clients. California has already added explicitly mental, emotional, and physical ability reasonably necessary for the performance of legal service to the definition of competence in its model rules. And this makes sense, doesn't it? It's pretty hard to meet your ethical duty of competence when you're feeling burnout, disengaged, and disconnected. You can't reliably meet that reasonable diligence or competence standard if you become addicted to a substance that impairs your cognitive ability. Now, we're not saying that everyone with depression symptoms isn't fit to practice law, or that waking up with a hangover makes you derelict in your professional duties. What we are saying is that self-care is a professional as well as a personal responsibility. And we owe it not just to ourselves, but to our clients to consider how to keep ourselves healthy. More to the point, it isn't just us saying these things. The National Task Force report on lawyer well-being is an indicator of how prevalent the need is for us to have open discussions about these issues. As we mentioned at the start, one of the recommendations the task force made was for law schools to implement some training to the next generation of lawyers, to encourage them, you, to think of well-being as both life skills and legal skills. Positive psychology is one discipline that provides us with tools to support our collective well-being. That's part of what inspired us to create this seminar, which we now present to every student in our law school before they graduate. Because professional responsibility is the only required part of our curriculum after the first year. Much of the focus of the research around lawyers, true to our natural tendency to spot issues, focuses on our challenges and naturally unhelpful personality traits. But the great news is that we're starting to raise awareness around these issues. And this discussion and the adoption of a healthier, profession-wide approach to our well-being will move us toward unlocking the great potential we have as lawyers and the many positive attributes we bring as individuals drawn to this important profession. This image is also borrowed from the task force report, and it nicely distills the difference between where we find ourselves now and where we could be if we evolve.
So with that as an introduction, let's talk about stress. It's an inescapable part of our lives as law students, and it'll continue to be part of our lives as lawyers, no matter how we use our law degrees. What we're going to talk about is a way of rethinking what stress is, reframing stress so that we understand its upside, its usefulness to us. Stress is not just a negative pressure. It's a signal from our surroundings, and if we pay attention to it in the right way, it can really help us get where we want to go, and we can achieve better outcomes in our work and professional lives. So how is it that there can be an upside to stress? Well, first, let's talk about what stress is. From an evolutionary perspective, stress was a survival instinct, a physical reaction to make me pay attention to an acute threat in my environment. If I'm walking through the woods and I see a wolf, that's something that deserves my total and undivided attention, or bad things are going to happen. So my stress response, which is often described as fight or flight, takes hold of my conscious thoughts and makes me pay attention and decide which of those options to follow to reach my desired outcome of survival. In today's world, stress often takes the form of challenges. For my students, it's exams or papers, areas where they're asked to display mastery of material that they need to know to move ahead in their chosen path. For practicing lawyers, the equivalent to exams are briefs or trials, contracts or deals. These are instances where the quality of our production is evaluated by others. That external evaluation is stressful, and preparing for it can be daunting. What exams are for law students, trials or oral arguments or deal negotiations are for practicing attorneys. These are the moments that you prepare for to demonstrate your craft, and they matter both to you and to your clients. So how you perform under these situations affects outcomes for your clients and may affect the cases and opportunities that come your way in the future. So it's only natural that you would feel that pressure and that your mind and therefore your body might perceive the judgments of others related to your work in these instances as a threat and create a stress response. We all know what stress feels like, but let's talk for a minute about what a stress response really is from a neurochemical or biochemical perspective. At a very high level, because after all, I'm an attorney, not a neuroscientist, the injection of a threat into our environment causes our brain to release a bunch of hormones. The hormones, including adrenaline, cortisol, and norepinephrine, among others, serve to focus and limit our attention and amp up our energy so that we have the ability to respond immediately to the threat in our environment. So adrenaline gets our blood pumping so that if we have to move quickly, we can. And norepinephrine makes us more alert and focuses our attention to the threat, zoning out on other distractions. Cortisol helps in both, releasing glucose, which is useful for short-term energy, and focusing our attention on the things that are essential. What happens then? Well, two things, one good, one bad. The good thing is we're focused on the threat. So for example, in the criminal justice world, we often talk to people who've been in situations where someone has attacked them with a deadly weapon. Their stress response focuses them on the weapon because that's the largest threat. But it does something else too. By focusing their attention on the threat, it limits their cognitive capacity. If you were less stressed out, you could think more. So many people who survive the threat of the weapon are very poor eyewitnesses, for example, because they weren't able to process what the gunman looked like while the stress response was diverting all of their attention to the gun itself. So the paradox of the stress response is that in the present day, where fight or flight is probably not physically necessary, stress may limit our cognitive capacity, which in turn means that we're less capable of thinking creatively about how to address the stress itself. Put differently, stress makes it harder to solve stressful situations that aren't solved by fight or flight, which, as it turns out, are most of the situations you're going to face in today's work environment. And it releases all of these hormones that make your heart beat faster, make your blood pressure soar, fill you with adrenaline and cortisol. It's like making the engine of your car race at 7,000 RPM all the time. And just like an engine can't sustain that level of work for long without breaking down, so too doing that to your heart is not great for your long-term health. So stress is a notification of a threat in our environment. Check. And as lawyers, we're primed to be constantly on alert for those threats from way far away and to be constantly planning to protect people from their threats as well. Check again. But let me tell you something that's equally true. There's actually a positive view of stress. So let's fight through the negativity bias together to get to this positive view of stress.
Now, as we've said, stress is something that is hardwired into us. But like everything else, our responses to stresses derive from both nature and nurture. And if we're going to construct and control our reactions to stress, it's important to understand what parts of our stress response are nature and what parts are nurture. So we're going to give you 2 parts nature, 1 part nurture. The first part of nature involves something we've already discussed: the fact that certain personality types are more likely to pursue a legal career. People who are drawn to the law have some pronounced innate tendencies. And as we've discussed, these might lead us to seek out situations that are stressful, or to experience a stress reaction in situations where others might not perceive stress. They might also prevent us from engaging with our social support networks when we most need them. Part 2 of the natural origin of stress is that all people suffer from a negativity bias. What we mean by that is, people give more weight to a negative event or potential outcome than they do to a positive event or outcome of equal significance. We focus more on the negative. And this goes back to the fight or flight reaction. The downside to us ignoring the wolf, that's a lot higher than the downside of ignoring a rainbow. So one of the things to keep in mind when we consider our reaction to stress is that our brains will always make the perceived threat seem worse than it really is. And when we tell ourselves that we've got the negative covered and there are positives, we will always be having an uphill battle with ourselves to convince ourselves of the positive, because we are wired to have a negativity bias. UNC psychologist Barbara Fredrickson has done great work in this area of positivity and negativity bias, if you'd like to learn more about this. But in addition to our natural predisposition as a community to respond to stressful situations in particularly lawyerly ways, our legal training can also have the perhaps unintended consequence of increasing the scope of things that stress us out. And that's the nurture part of the stress response. What do we train every attorney to do? What is every 1L law school exam designed to elicit? We are trained from the very first days as law students to spot potential issues. We're trained to constantly scan the horizon and look for threats. We're trained to approach all situations with skepticism, to consider all the potential ways a potential deal could go wrong, and to spool these scenarios out into their logical or conceivable conclusions, so that we can plan for our clients and protect them from the unknown. And we teach them to negotiate disputes through an argumentative and confrontational style, an adversarial system. So it's actually the obligation of the attorneys on the opposite side of a litigation or transaction to highlight the weaknesses in our positions and our approaches to secure the best result for our clients. So we have both heightened awareness of weakness, both in our client's legal position and in our own performance, and similarly trained professionals who are not just willing, but in fact obligated to expose those weaknesses to others. So there we are. We've taken people already predisposed to be skeptical, antisocial, urgent, and autonomous, and we've taught them that it is their job to be hyper-attuned to potential threats that may or may not ever materialize, and to try to identify every potential outcome and threat. No wonder we're stressed. Now, the fact of the matter is that as legal educators, we're right. Those are useful skills for client representation. Your clients will be forever grateful for them. Nobody wants a lawyer who wears rose-colored glasses and is unattuned to risk and threat. But it's also true that the negativity bias and skepticism combined with the issue spotting and scenario spooling can cause us to approach not only our work, but our entire lives in a pessimistic way. We can do issue spotting in our own lives and scenario spooling and catastrophic thinking, and we can navigate personal relationships through adversarial negotiation and argument. Not surprisingly, that may contribute to negative personal outcomes, and we may find ourselves unintentionally generating unnecessary stress in our professional and personal lives. As we said, you're welcome. In fact, for us, and we suspect for a lot of you, we can experience the most stress when there's conflict among things we care about. If John is on a conference call and his cell phone flashes and it's his daughter calling from school, that's stressful. Or if I have a work obligation and it means I'm late to pick up my son from school, yeah, I'm stressed. We've had students who are helping their parents raise their siblings while trying to read cases for class the next day, or trying to study for exams when they know their significant other wants them to be somewhere else doing something important to the relationship. All of these things are enormously stressful because they put the things that are important to us, school, profession, family, relationships, money, directly into conflict with one another. So how do you frame that as a positive? Trust McGonagall. This is my body telling me that I have an opportunity to positively influence things that I care about. And you're fortunate that you care about lots of things. That's an indicator that you're living a full life. You care about all of those facets of well-being that we showed at the beginning of this talk, and you're paying attention to them all. When you push yourself to have a full life, conflicts are sometimes unavoidable. But you get to show your kids, your parents, your friends that career and family can coexist. You get to show your coworkers that you and they can be productive lawyers and good parents, siblings, friends. And while maybe we aren't able to give everyone exactly what they want all the time, they do get to learn the importance of each of us giving a little in our lives for the people we care about, because not everything revolves around us. And we can model both the difficult balancing act and the full life it allows us to enjoy, which will benefit the well-being of those we care about in their own lives. Now, that sort of positive reframing has its limits. Does it eliminate stress? No. But it changes our body's response to stress, and that helps us with cognitive clarity and the ability to think more clearly and with less hypertension as we process the stress. Are we always satisfied with the way we've handled things? No, of course not. But when we tell ourselves, I'm excited to pursue a variety of things that are important to me, my job, my family, my friends, my health, my financial security, and that I'm rising to the occasion, our body believes us and follows suit, and we stay calmer and get better outcomes.
Stress is the reaction you have whenever something you care about is at stake. Let's say that again out loud because it's one of the key takeaways of this seminar. Stress is the reaction you have whenever something you care about is at stake. Think about the things that stress you out. Maybe even spend 30 seconds saying them out loud to yourself. And think about the examples we've used so far. For every single one, the things that stress us out do so because we care about them. Law school exams, client matters, our children, our friends, our parents, our work relationships. If we didn't care about them, we wouldn't get stressed. So what does that mean? Well, it means that stress is not necessarily there just to make us miserable. To the contrary, it's a chance for us to rise to the occasion. If you're Usain Bolt, yeah, you're going to be stressed before a big race because you care about it, you've trained for it, and this is the moment you get to show what you can do. Ditto for a law school exam or a trial or a surgery or whatever it might be. But let's think about the difference there. If you view stress as a negative, you'll be dreading that event. But if you adjust your mindset just a little bit and think about this as an opportunity, a chance to rise to the occasion for something you care about, you can actually say to yourself, I'm not intimidated by this. I'm excited by this. This is a chance for me to make a difference in an area I've chosen to focus on. I want you to say that again out loud with me. Think about a stressful situation that you have in your day-to-day life at work and say, I'm excited by this. This is a chance for me to make a difference in an area I've chosen to focus on. Let this be your new mantra. Say it in the mirror when you wake up in the morning, and say to yourself every time you feel that stress reaction building up inside you. As we're about to show you, doing so will help both your mental and physical reactions to stress, and that will lead to an improved chance of a better outcome for whatever it is you're caring about in this moment. The woman that we have to thank for this positive reframing of stress is Stanford psychologist Kelly McGonigal, who published some really interesting research on stress in her book, The Upside of Stress. If you'd like a condensed version, her TED Talk on this topic has more than 7 million views. Dr. McGonigal has done a lot of homework on stress, and she's learned that fight or flight is not the only response available to us when our bodies manifest stress. Instead of fight or flight, we can choose what she calls the challenge response. Stress is not something to be afraid of. Remember our mantra, stress is a signal to pay attention and focus on something we care about, and it's a signal that we're facing a challenge and we have the opportunity to meet that challenge and rise above it. McGonigal's research actually shows that people whose response to stress is, I'm excited, have a different biological and physiological reaction to stress than people whose response is, I'm frightened. And it's even different than people whose response is, I'm calm. When your response is fear, you get that fight or flight response, and your heart rate goes up, your blood vessels tighten. When your response is excitement, your blood vessels actually stay more relaxed. So the impact of stress on your health is not as negative, and your cognitive capacity stays wide open. This means that in the short term, you're actually more likely to execute and get a positive outcome to your situation. And in the longer term, you're less likely to suffer negative health consequences from repeated stressful scenarios. McGonigal's research is supported by one of her Stanford colleagues, Alia Crum, who studies the placebo effect and the mind-body connection to performance. Dr. Crum conducted a clinical study where she divided people into 3 groups. One group, called the enhancing group, watched 3 15-minute videos, one time each, over the course of a week, in which stress as an opportunity was the theme. Pressure is a privilege, I get a chance to rise to the occasion, that sort of thing. Just one 15-minute video every other day for a week, that's all. Another group, called the debilitating group, got shown 3 videos as well, but their videos portrayed stress as a negative, soul-crushing, unavoidable bummer. The third group, the control group, watched videos of like the Golden Girls, something that didn't discuss stress at all. Now, what Dr. Crum found was exactly what we would expect to find if McGonigal was right. In the upper left corner of this slide, we see that the way people perceived stress affected their mindset. In other words, if we watched the positive videos, we were more likely to perceive stress as an opportunity, where if we watched the negative videos, we were more likely to see it as a negative. This, in turn, affected our health. People who had a positive stress mindset started the study with fewer health symptoms, meaning that they felt better, and reported a marked improvement in health at the end of the study. They reported a reduction in health symptoms, while the debilitating cohort reported more health symptoms and felt worse. In addition, using a variety of soft or perceptual and hard or externally measurable work performance metrics, the people who viewed stress as a positive actually achieved better outcomes at work than people who viewed stress as a negative. So what do we take from this? Well, 2 things. First, the way we approach stress affects our ability to manage that stress and our ability to execute and secure the outcomes we want. And second, it really doesn't take much to make a measurable difference in how our bodies respond to stress. The way we think about stress affects the way we react to stress. And we can change the way we think about stress with a fairly minimal intervention of conscious thought. To me, that's both fascinating and really encouraging. Now, at this point, you might be saying to yourself, hey, John and Jen, it's really interesting, but how do I know where my stress mindset is? So we're glad you asked. Here's the measurement tool that Dr. Crum used in her experiment to see where people in her experiment started and finished in terms of the positive mindset for stress before and after the videos. It's an 8-question self-reported survey that you can do in less than 5 minutes. The website link is here, or you can just Google Stanford Mind and Body Lab. A score of 1 to 10 means you're more prone to view stress in a negative light. 11 to 20 puts you sort of in the middle. And 21 to 30 means you're more inclined to think of stress as exciting and an opportunity. Now, if you scored 1 to 10, don't freak out. What that means is that you'll probably have to work a little harder, remind yourself more forcefully and more insistently of this research, and you'll have a bit more negativity bias to combat. But again, what the research shows is that 3 15-minute videos watched once had a measurable impact on stress mindset and reported health symptoms. You can change your mindset and you can grow it. It's doable. So it's important to remind ourselves at this point what we're saying. Changing your stress mindset will not eliminate stress. If stress is what happens when something you care about is affected, then you'll have stress as long as you have things you care about. In fact, to some extent, you should welcome the stress, because if you don't have anything you care about, you're probably not living a life of fulfillment or flourishing. Let's take 5 minutes now and do a little practice on positive reframing. Break up in groups of 2 to 3 people, and each of you spend 2 to 3 minutes sharing with your partner an example of something that's stressful in your day-to-day life. There's a possibility you'll be asked to share it with the class, so make it something that you don't mind if everybody knows. Share that stressful incident with your partner and let your partner reframe it back to you, identifying the thing you care about and why it's useful for you to respond to that situation in a way that promotes something you care about. Then switch places and do the same thing. So hit pause on your computer and we'll be here when you come back. How was that? Were you able to position some of your stressors as opportunities? One thing to keep in mind is that sometimes we reframe indirectly. So directly would be a situation where we say, this is an opportunity, but indirect might be where we're accepting something that's not ideal in itself with the understanding that it helps us achieve goals in other parts of our lives that are also really important to us. That kind of reframing is a way of adapting that eases our acceptance. My job might not be perfect, but it does have its good points, and the money I make helps my children live lives that I want them to lead. Or the challenging case I'm on, which is really giving me fits, is also sharpening my advocacy skills and giving me experience that will help me take on and win larger cases in the future. It's that sort of thing that we mean by indirect. So when you have stress, stop and consider, is there a way to reframe this as a positive in your larger life of well-being? How is this furthering your larger life goals? When my daughter was in high school, she wanted to do theater and elective courses, but she hated having to do a sport each term, and she really wasn't interested in science courses. So we practiced reframing. I said to her, actually, athletics will help you with coordination, and performing athletics will help you learn how to stay calm when you're performing in theater. Plus, science tells us that exercises actually increase cognitive energy, so you'll be more perceptive in class and in theater if you work out every day. On the science courses, I said, yeah, I get it. These aren't really what you're into, and they weren't really what I was into either. But believe it or not, you're going to be glad you did this. Science is a different way for you to learn how to solve problems, and the focus on logic will really help you write stories that have tighter arguments and are more persuasive, and it'll be great for your essays. And these courses tick off boxes that you need for your college degree, which is an achievement that really increases your chances of success in whatever you choose to pursue in life. So while the short term is a little drudgery, the long term is really much brighter because of these classes. Now, my daughter laughed in my face at the time, but it will sink in little by little with her, just as it does with yourself. So positive reframing is one approach to stress, but it's certainly not the only one. Let's explore some other things that we can do to reduce and better handle the stress that comes our way. One way to do this is to be intentional about how you approach the things in life that you find stressful. Let's divide the world into stressors that we can change and stressors that we can't. And a lot of stressors, actually, unfortunately, we can't change. There's not much I can do to change the fact that, for example, somebody I care about may be recovering from a car accident, or that I might have a parent who has a chronic illness. But we can deploy different strategies for the different types of stress. And here we see 4 responses to stress. If you can change the stress, consider how that would happen. You might alter the situation, or you might avoid it. If your organization has staff meetings that are drudgery, for example, you might alter the situation by talking to your colleagues about changing the format of the meeting, or you might reduce its frequency or its duration, or you might avoid it altogether. If you have a meeting that conflicts with your son's soccer game or a big event for your significant other, you might talk to colleagues about how to reschedule the meeting, for example. So alter or avoid are two responses to changeable stressors. Now, if the stress is just out there and we can't change it, we have two other options. We can accept it or we can adapt to it. Sometimes we miss events related to our kids or our families. I certainly have. I hate it, but I've had to accept it. And sometimes we construct other solutions that will help us tend to one another. When my dad was sick, I worked with my brother and stepmother to make sure he was in a situation where he was receiving the absolute best care we could provide on a reliable basis with the least burden on everyone involved. We couldn't make him better, so we changed what we could, and then we accepted the rest. In a very practical way, this is like the serenity prayer. You need the courage to change the things you can, the serenity to accept the things you can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. But what we're going to talk about for the rest of this time is things we can do to adapt to stress, to maximize our response to stress above and beyond viewing it as exciting. Because no matter how good we are at reframing, some stressors are just really hard to view as exciting.
Can you think of a time, maybe in law school, when you studied something that simply did not resonate with you at the time? Did you become frustrated and view it as a complete waste of time? Can you think of a way to reframe it as something positive? For example, when I was a first-year student, I absolutely hated Socratic method. There was nothing that caused me greater stress academically than being put on the spot in front of all of my classmates to answer really challenging questions that seemed to have no right answer. My heart would race. I would be unable to focus on anything but getting to the end of the exercise. And I spent most of my time just hurtling myself from one Socratic inquiry to the next, trying as best I could to get to the end of the year. Now, in hindsight, I recognized that my body was responding to the stress as a threat manner Dr. McGonigal discusses. I was unable to think clearly because my body went into flight mode, only I didn't flee. Instead, I fumbled my way through the answer until the professor moved on. The immediate threat disappeared and my pulse and heart rate returned to normal. If I had instead reframed the experience, I might have enjoyed a better outcome. If instead of thinking, oh my gosh, this really smart professor is going to completely embarrass me in front of everyone, and everyone will have no choice but to conclude that I'm a moron and I have to get out of this situation as fast as I can, I could have reframed it and said, wow, I have the opportunity to engage in a difficult topic that I studied in advance of this class with someone who is an expert in this subject matter. Even though I know I won't perform perfectly, I know that I'll get stronger as a result of the experience, which will help me become a better lawyer over time. And maybe in the process, I can even help my classmates feel less afraid when it's their turn, so that we can all amplify our learning. Would this have stopped the stress? Certainly not. But it would have allowed me to channel all of that nervous energy into a different emotion, excitement. And that change could have helped me grow from the experience, rather than simply finish the class. So we've talked about defining stress as a condition that exists when something we care about is at stake. Another way to think of stress is that we feel stress when a situation is different than the way we wish it were. In other words, we get stressed about things that we feel we can't control. Those are things that we have to accept or adapt to. One of these things is that as lawyers, we don't always have control of our time. We wish we did, but we don't, and this creates stress. We need to accept this as the price of having the opportunity to serve our clients and help them understand and solve problems. And we need to help our loved ones understand this too. Law is a service business, and that means that others' needs sometimes take priority over our personal needs. That's what the professional responsibilities of competence and diligence mean. We do our best to resolve those conflicts, but sometimes a client needs something that requires an all-nighter at an inopportune time. And the business model for most of us is time-based, meaning that our time is what we have to give to provide that service. And time is a limited commodity that lacks leverage. And particularly for more junior lawyers, we're not in control of that. So while we'll use alteration and avoidance as much as possible, there is a certain acceptance of the path we've chosen that's necessary. And if we can't accept that, then we may need to alter our environment by practicing in a different way or by doing something different for a living. These are things we do our best to alter and amend, but sometimes we have to accept and adapt. Another tool that can be helpful here, and which we'll talk about later, is mindfulness and meditation.
There are several relatively straightforward things you can do besides reframing techniques that will help your ability to handle stress and deepen your resources for stress management. The simplest things and the most dependable things: eat, sleep, and exercise regularly. Now, I know sometimes this is easier said than done. Sometimes you're going to pull an all-nighter, sometimes you're going to miss a workout. That's okay. Over time, though, you know as well as we do that you need energy to withstand the onrush of the stress response and to think to yourself, no, wait, this isn't soul-crushing, this is an opportunity, and I can do this. And eating, sleeping, and exercise give your body the energy it needs so that psychologically you can do the things we've been talking about. Now, what clinical professionals will tell you is that these three things, these basic necessities, these are also the tsunami buoys that help us identify when we or others are descending into that crisis state. So if you or a colleague are regularly not eating, not sleeping, and not getting any exercise, or you're falling into behaviors that might suggest substance abuse, pay attention to that and be ready to give yourself or your colleague access to a professional that can help them. We'll have some resources for that on the last slide. Let's talk a little bit more about sleep. You know what I know. 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night is recommended as the optimal amount for most people. And if you're like me, you're like, yeah, right, I'd also like to be 7 feet tall and playing in the NBA. There's no way I'm going to get 8 hours of sleep a night. So I'm going to tell you that, yeah, that's optimal, but I'm also going to say that no matter how many hours of sleep you can get, here are 2 ways to improve the quality of the sleep you do get so that at least you're making the most of your sleep time. The first thing is to put your computer and your phone and your iPad away an hour before you go to sleep, ideally in another room so buzzes and things in the middle of the night don't disturb you. The blue rays that come from our screens inhibit melatonin, which is the hormone we need for a deep and restful sleep. Putting those screens away and doing something else that doesn't get you all riled up will increase your chance of getting a good night's sleep. For me, it's Jackson Browne and doing the dishes. I find that to be kind of zen and calming, and I'm not looking at computer screens. It's probably something different for you.
By the way, this might not be the best time to strike up a conversation with your parents or significant other about politics, finances, or other potential hot-button items in your household. This is a time to try to let your mind rest easy, not to engage in passionate debates. And finally, when you're getting into bed, give yourself 5 minutes to quietly reflect on the day. Think about the things that went well. Studies have shown that people who list 3 good things from the day, no matter how apparently trivial, have a more positive outlook and feel better the next day. Today the bus arrived as soon as I got to the stop, so I was early for class. Or, today I handled that call with Ron and Betty really well. Or, today I really enjoyed singing to the radio on the drive home. All of these qualify. And consider your approach to tomorrow and how you'll work to be effective at the things you want to do. Taken together, these things will help your quality of sleep and prepare you to excel tomorrow.
Another way to adapt to stress in your environment, particularly for younger attorneys, is to reduce your use of social media. In a recent study released by some of my colleagues here at Penn, students who limited their use of the big 4 social media apps, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Snapchat, found that their FOMO, their fear of missing out, was reduced. And with it, they found that students who had indicated higher levels of symptoms of depression or loneliness found that those symptoms also were measurably reduced. Note that nothing in their lives had actually changed, but as you all know, social media can be a relentless, incessant stream of other people posting their best selves online. When I was a younger guy, I knew there were parties I wasn't invited to, but I didn't see them playing out in real time while I was in the office or at home or in my dorm room by myself. That's what we have to address today. All those people have stress and chaos in their lives too, but we don't see it on social media. So limit the time we spend going down that rabbit hole. It'll make you feel better. And the idea that people only are posting their highlight reel on social media is important because stress is something we all have in our lives, but we all think that other people are better at handling that stress than we are. That's part of the social media deceit. At Penn, we have something called Penn Face. It's the face you put on to walk down Locust Walk in the center of campus and act like you've got it all together when inside you feel like you are failing in all aspects. At Stanford, they call it duck syndrome. It's the perception that all people see is the calm of the duck above the water, while underneath, that duck is furiously paddling just to stay afloat. And this movement is growing at schools all around the country because no matter where you are, we all suffer to some extent from imposter syndrome. The idea that everybody else has it all figured out and is living the perfect life, and only you are scrambling and pretending to have it all together. That masks the value of our collective human challenge. That struggle, that's how we get strong and create strong social bonds. That struggle builds our emotional capacity and our sense of community. And it's human for all of us. So don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. Why is this linkage to other people important? Well, it goes back again to the biochemistry of stress. It turns out there's another hormone that helps to reduce the cortisol and adrenaline of the stress response. It's called oxytocin. You may know of oxytocin because it's involved in inducing birth, and it's secreted by the brain in lactation. But part of the reason for that is that oxytocin is a social hormone. It helps us trust and make social connections. And the stress response impels us then, with the release of oxytocin, to go make social connections. This makes sense because, two of us against the wolf is more likely to yield a positive outcome than me alone against the wolf. A herd helps. So we generate a hormone that helps us make social connections when we're stressed and helps to reduce our anxiety. Connecting with others helps to mediate our stress, and it helps to balance our negativity bias by connecting us with somebody who can provide more objective feedback and remind us what's true to combat our self-directed negativity bias. They can also approach that situation without the reduced cognitive capacity that we have when we're stressed, so they can help us problem solve. So find a confidant. When I was a young attorney, the associates on my hall were really great at looking out for one another, and it made a huge difference. Sometimes I was under the gun, sometimes they were, but I knew it wasn't just me, and because I knew how talented they were and that sometimes they needed help too, that it was okay for me to need help and to ask for it. So make those social connections because it'll help you moderate your stress response.
Another activity that really can help you manage your stress response is a mindfulness or meditation practice. Now, I used to be a skeptic about the power of mindfulness and meditation. It all sounded a little bit out there for me. And even though I went along a few times and tried it out, it didn't really do anything for me. Then, about a year ago, I was dealing with a fair amount of turmoil in different areas of my life. And I was really struggling a great deal with ruminating, rethinking things I had said, emailed, or done, and harshly judging all of them in a way that was both unhelpful to the task at hand and damaging to my well-being. Someone suggested I try meditation, and because other methods just weren't working, I did. A year later, I can say that a daily 10-minute meditation practice has helped me enormously in ways I didn't even fully appreciate before I started. A regular meditation practice, which you can begin using free or low-cost apps like Headspace or Calm, or using YouTube videos, helps train your brain to be able to refocus on the present moment. Through a variety of techniques, including breathing exercises, scanning the body, noting thoughts and feelings, and then releasing them and returning to the breath, you can actually build up your ability to think more clearly, to be aware of and let go of emotions as they come and go in our mind. The result is that we're no longer inhabited by the emotion. So I'm not angry, I'm experiencing anger, which I know will pass, and I have the ability to acknowledge and let go. This ability to note and release feelings and thoughts as they come and go allows us to control the things we choose to engage with. It also allows us to zoom out and see the bigger picture more clearly. If we zoom in on a given threat, the wolf or the gun in our earlier examples, and that zooming in prevents us from seeing anything else clearly, meditation supports us in being aware of everything and controlling our focus. In a recent study of first-year law students at the University of Missouri, one else who practiced mindfulness meditation regularly saw improvements in stress, well-being, and mindful awareness. As one student explained, she was able to be more resilient during final exams because fear became just another thought she was able to observe and let go. Other students reported improvement in sleep patterns over the course of the study. Mindfulness meditation can be a powerful tool for attorneys in particular, because it can help us manage our stress more effectively, can allow us to focus more deeply on the work at hand, and can allow us to be more creative in our approach to legal problems. Because we're able to be less attached to the threat response we might experience from, say, an angry email, and become more able to let go of our emotional reaction and consider alternative ways to respond. And the final wonderful thing about meditation is that it's very hard to say you can't fit it into your day. Even if you're the busiest person on the planet, you can find 60 seconds lying in bed, taking a shower, on the bus, in an elevator to practice meditation. And that makes it the perfect tool for lawyers. That is, if we put aside our natural skepticism and give it a try.
So there you have it. We can't give you a stress-free life, but the good news is, it turns out you don't really want one. You want to live a life of meaning and thriving, a life where there's lots of things you care about and where your actions have meaning and impact. And stress is a signal that it's time for you to focus on one of those things and make it a priority so that something you care about gets improved. That's a good thing. And you can then be prepared and capable, and you can rise to that occasion. Your mental approach will impact your physical approach and help you achieve your goals. The way we think about stress affects the way we feel about stress. When we accept stress as a challenge and an opportunity, we increase our ability to handle stress and to achieve our desired outcomes. Even better news? Small modifications in this area have measurable results. 3 15-minute videos once made a difference. Remind yourself of this and you'll be rewarded over time. And finally, don't try to do it all alone. We're all in this together. We all struggle from time to time. Reach out to others, make those connections, share your experiences and your challenges. The relationships with others will help, and we're all going through what you're going through in one way or another.
There's more from positive psychology that we can use to enhance the way we think about and the way we approach the various spheres of our lives as we attempt to find that balance of spheres of well-being that help us flourish or thrive. As we discussed with stress, and as we'll see more in the next hour, the words we use when we talk to ourselves has a lot to do with how our body responds and how we design favorable outcomes. Let's talk about realistic optimism, the art of thinking positively, but not being naive or blind to data, and resilience, the ability to bounce back from adversity. Now, as you'll recall from Larry Richards' work on the psychology of lawyers, optimism and resilience are things that a lot of us don't necessarily have in great supply. Also, as we've pointed out, skepticism is actually a trained skill in law school. We want you to be critical thinkers. We want you anticipating where things might go wrong and where gaps might exist in a system. But that can also lead to some negative outcomes, both professionally and personally.
We've also talked about negativity bias, though we're going to see a slightly different side of negativity bias here. In a stress context, negativity bias works by our brain and our body working together to prioritize a potential threat more than it would to pay attention to something positive. When we're analyzing situations, on the other hand, negativity bias means that our brains are more likely to help us identify risks and give them greater priority than they are likely to help us see and prioritize opportunity. This may be particularly true when we're evaluating change, which can be risky. All we'll see is the risks, and even if there are equal opportunities, we may not view that objectively because of negativity bias. So you can see how negativity bias might be helpful for survival, though not optimal for thriving. If all we do is avoid risk, we're probably not pushing ourselves, experiencing all we could, or living a fulfilling life. We can also see how it might be great for clients, though again, if all we do is identify their risks and we don't measure them accurately, we're not helping our clients as much as we could. But it's probably a bit of a drag in our personal lives. Imagine if every opportunity that comes to you or those you love is greeted with skepticism, risk, and perceived threats. How do you think your loved ones are going to react to that? What we want to talk about then is the way that we evaluate situations that happen to us every day and how to make sure we're giving ourselves the gift of objective self-evaluation. We call that a gift because we naturally tend to the skeptical and the pessimistic. It's an act of self-respect and self-care to make sure that we don't let negativity bias hold us back or misanalyze situations that could help us thrive. The science of objective self-evaluation, what we're going to call realistic optimism, originates with Dr. Martin Seligman, one of our colleagues at Penn and a creator of the field of positive psychology. Dr. Seligman has written several books on this topic, Learned Optimism, Authentic Happiness, and more recently, Flourish. And his research focuses on the role of positive emotions to help guide desired outcomes in our lives. Here's a quote from him on one of the dangers of pessimism. Pessimism is a risk factor for depression in just the same sense as smoking is a risk factor for lung cancer or being a hostile, hard-driving person is a risk factor for a heart attack. What he's saying here is essentially what has come to be known as cognitive behavioral therapy. In the same way we exercise our muscles, we create and sustain neural pathways. When we change the way we talk to ourselves, we change the way we think. We engage in the gradual act of rewiring neural pathways, and as new pathways are created, they become easier and easier to access, and our behaviors change. This helps us mitigate against depressive factors and other mental or behavioral health risks. You can think of optimism then as a way to balance the scales against negativity bias. We're going to train ourselves to see the positive in things and the opportunities that scenarios present to us because we know that both our natural wiring and our training as lawyers might cause those neural pathways to become diminished. To truly be objective, we need that attentiveness and that intentionality towards positivity. Now, some of you might be thinking what one of my friends, who's a very successful general counsel, said to me when we discussed this topic of optimism. He said, John, if you look at it, optimists do better than pessimists on every scale except one. Pessimists are usually right. And I want to address that because he's not entirely wrong, but he does kind of miss the point. What Seligman would say to that, I think, is that the world is not all unicorns and rainbows, but to use the punchline of a very old joke about optimism, there is a pony in here someplace. There are times when unchecked optimism can cause us to gloss over risks that matter, and there are times where pessimism can cause us to miss opportunity. So what we need is realistic optimism. In his books, Seligman actually specifically calls out attorneys and says it's important that they use pessimism in their professional lives and when advising clients. Pessimism is useful for giving counsel. If you're talking to non-attorneys who tend to be more optimistic, a gentle observation of risks that can then be managed is helpful. And we also don't want to rave about optimism and how wonderful a future can be when we're dealing with someone who's wrestling with grief or sadness. Instead, what we want to do is acknowledge their pain, acknowledge their misfortune, the bad event or the challenge, and then gradually start to talk about what will come after the pain has receded a little bit, where we go from here, now shifting to positive vocabulary to build them back up. What the research of Seligman and others shows is that training ourselves to see the positive has benefits in a lot of different areas. It helps us set and achieve goals, it strengthens our personal relationships, and it improves our emotional responses to information. People who exhibit more optimism tend to have improved health and fewer negative health consequences over time. It's actually true that people who self-report as optimists also report fewer days of colds or flu, for example. And optimists are more likely to see success as leaders or managers in a work setting. But let's talk about what happens when a negative event occurs. It could be a major thing. Maybe you blow a deadline and a case gets dismissed, or it might be a little bit more mundane. Maybe you just mishandled a conversation and it went poorly and you know you screwed it up. But we all know the reaction that we have. We get that sinking feeling in our stomach, that flood of emotion, which is actually very similar to a stress reaction. And the hormones that are released by that have much the same effect. They narrow our cognitive focus and cause us to freeze. Something that we didn't want to happen has happened despite us, which is a really disempowering thing. It's something that makes us feel helpless. So now we not only feel less powerful and able, but our cognitive capacities are more limited because we're focused on the bad thing and not on what we do next. As a result, we're actually less capable of formulating an effective plan and response. So it's not surprising at that point that the likelihood of another bad event occurring actually goes up, and we run an increased risk of descending into this downward spiral of negative emotions. But the converse is true as well. When a bad thing happens and we overcome it, it inspires us. We relax and we feel more capable. That confidence inspires us, and the skills that we use to overcome the hurdle both increase our cognitive capabilities and reassure us that we can withstand negative outcomes, which allows us to tackle new challenges with increased agency and self-efficacy. In short, we can also enter an upward spiral, and the positive energy allows us to broaden and build, in the words of psychologist Barbara Fredrickson. So what are the tools that we use to stop the downward spiral and bounce back into an upward spiral? That ability to bounce back from a setback is called resilience, and the tools that we use are called resilience protective factors. And good news, there's lots of them, as this slide shows, and we can use them alone or in combination depending on the situation. Let's go in clockwise order from top left. Some people rely on courage, the emotional response of risking failure again when you know there's a chance you'll take another hit. The institutions of our life, our law school, our law firm, our department or company, these also have mechanisms designed to help us when things go wrong. Now we're talking about optimism, so more on this later. People rely on their moral compasses. Sometimes the path that we know is right is not easy, and we suffer for our decisions, but we're confident in the moral correctness of what we do, and it gives us strength and helps us to endure and re-engage. For some people, faith or spirituality is very, very useful in coping with adversity. Other people use social connections or ask themselves what their role models would do. That's the guy standing behind a podium in the top right corner, in case that's not immediately obvious to you. If we go now right to left along the bottom, some people use a sense of humor as a resilience protective factor to cope with frustration or adversity. If any of you haven't heard Tig Notaro's stand-up act on her life when her long-term relationship had ended, she almost died from a GI infection, and she was diagnosed with breast cancer, you should look it up online. It's one of the most inspiring, hilarious, and resilient things you'll ever hear. Flexibility is a trait others use in adapting and building new structures to respond to setbacks. Self-esteem is a protective factor. If I see myself as capable and competent, it helps me understand that this is a temporary setback, something I can and will come back from. A growth mindset, the idea that our talents and abilities aren't fixed, but instead that we can learn from adversity and be better able to deal with it in the future. And self-regulation, the ability to control ourselves and our responses. This was a big one from my mother-in-law, who's legendary for telling her children, "You can't help how you feel, but you can help how you act." And last but not least, physical activity can be a great release of anxiety, anger, and frustration, all of the predictable but unproductive reactions to a setback. And once we've had that release, we're more able to focus on how to move forward. All of these things, each of these things, can be useful to us when we're dealing with the curveballs we'll receive in life. It's important to remember that all of these abilities are available to each of us when we have a setback, and they're there to get us back on track. And make no mistake, we will have setbacks. First of all, if you're growing, you're challenging yourself. And when you challenge yourself, you push the limits of what you're able to do, and mistakes will happen. Second of all, no matter who we are, life also throws unexpected challenges our way. But people who make conscious use of resilience protective factors have reported a variety of positive outcomes in clinical studies, including increased adaptability and problem-solving skills, more focus on positive outcomes and less focus on worst-case scenarios, improved relationships, and improved physical health. Drilling down a bit further to an audience of practicing attorneys, a survey of 650 practicing lawyers found that lawyers who reported actively using these resilience protective factors were 3 times more likely to report that their engagement and their commitment to their work was meaningfully improved. So knowing that you've got a safety net, knowing what it is, and knowing that you can deploy it actually helps you in the practice of law. As we've said, optimism is one of the resilience protective factors, and it may be one that many lawyers don't innately use as often as they could. So let's do a little exercise here. Like we did before, you should pair up or get together in a group of 3. If you're by yourself, you can just write this down. Each person takes a turn describing a situation in their life that didn't go the way they wanted it to go, and explaining why they think it didn't go well. What were the causative factors? And the other person then does the same. We're going to give each of you a minute or 2 to do this, and then we'll reconvene. To simulate this, let me tell you about a Little League baseball play. The player is playing shortstop, and a hard-hit ground ball comes right at him. Just as it gets to him, it hits the lip of the infield grass and it scoots past him, and the other team scores and wins the game. Now consider the possible responses that you might have from this young player. Maybe you've even said these things yourself. The first player says, "Man, I really wish I could do that play over again. I took a bad bounce, which was pretty unlucky at a bad moment. Next time, I'm going to be more ready for that. Maybe I'll get my knee and glove lower to block the ball if that happens." The second player says, "Oh, I cannot believe I blew that play. Maybe I just shouldn't play because I'm clearly not that good at it. I always mess up on ground balls. I've got to field that ball. I've got to stop that run from scoring. Instead, I keep making mistakes and letting my teammates down." Now, which one of those players is using optimism as a form of resilience, and which one is being pessimistic and likely to stay in that downward spiral? Obviously, the kid who describes the play as a bad bounce and unlucky and who wants to get back in there and do it again is our optimist. How do we know? Well, we know by the way each kid spoke to himself. Going back again to Dr. Seligman's research, optimism and pessimism can be learned and reinforced by our speaking styles, and he's isolated the characteristics of each speaking style. People who have a pessimistic mindset tend to speak in 3 ways that all start with the letter P. First, they speak in the vocabulary of permanence. "I've never been good at that," or "this always happens to me." Or sometimes it's just a definitive, "I'm bad at math." But pessimists don't see a world they can change or that they have the power to change, and so they speak in these permanent terms. Contrast that with the optimistic young man who viewed his setback as temporary. He wants to get back out there again and try a new approach, which he thinks will help him be more successful, and he characterizes the play as a bad moment. Second, pessimists speak in a pervasive sense, a sense that everything is bad, whereas an optimistic speaking style tends to compartmentalize and limit the extent of the issue. Our optimistic kid talks about missing a single ground ball, where our pessimistic kid expands that out to being a bad baseball player and always missing all these balls overall. It could be that he handled each of his other defensive chances well, and maybe he had 3 hits in the game, but none of that is getting reflected in his self-assessment. Finally, pessimists tend to personalize. They take an oversized responsibility for bad occurrences. Optimists, by contrast, tend to externalize. They put the responsibility for bad occurrences on external factors. The pessimist thinks he's responsible for not fielding the ball. The optimist points out that it took an unexpected bounce because of field conditions and there was nothing he could have done to prevent that. Does he still regret not making the play? Sure. But he's got a less punitive sense of responsibility for the outcome, and that helps him formulate a plan for future success. Another issue around responsibility is experience. Maybe the kid in our example is not an experienced infielder, but is more used to playing outfield, so he or she wasn't as prepared for how to prepare for the ball. Similarly, you might find that the first time you do things in practice, they take longer, feel far more awkward, and you make more mistakes. That's not a sign that you are doomed to a horrible career. It's a sign that you're pushing into unfamiliar territory, which is how we grow. So if you want to help yourself be more resilient, one of the keys is to speak to yourself using optimistic speaking styles. Try to watch yourself and avoid permanent, pervasive, and personal evaluations of bad outcomes. Don't ignore your contributions to the setback, but challenge yourself to be temporary, compartmentalized, and to include external causes as well. So let's practice that. Go back with your partner for a couple minutes and revisit your explanations for the setback you chose to talk about. Did you speak in pessimistic terms or optimistic ones? How would you rephrase your explanation to make things even more optimistic? One of the challenges to optimistic speaking style is the negativity bias that we have, which causes us to view ourselves much more critically than we view others. The classic example of this is the time that you as a law student gave an answer to a question from your professor in one of your classes that didn't go as well as you might have hoped. Spend a minute or two with your partner, share with each other what went through your head after you screwed up a question. Once you've done that, say to your partner what you would say if your partner came up to you after class and verbalized that reaction. Do you notice how much differently you speak to others about the same event than you speak to yourself? That's negativity bias and pessimistic speaking style in action. So let's talk about a couple of techniques that you can use to remind yourself to speak more optimistically and to use that realistic optimism that we talked about to combat negativity bias and provide yourself with a more objective mental playing field that will help you be more resilient. First, let's focus on which of our inner voices we choose to listen to. You know what I mean. Are we going to listen to that massively critical inner voice, or are there more reasonable inner voices that are giving us more constructive feedback? I think of this as deciding which American Idol judge in my head I'm going to listen to. We know that the loudest voice out there is the most negative one, Simon. He's the first voice we hear. That was absolutely awful. But he's not the only perspective, and just because negativity bias makes him louder doesn't mean he's right. Well, I'm not saying we should all be listening only to our inner Paula. It's not all rainbows and unicorns. But maybe once you've heard Simon, ask yourself what your inner Randy is saying. He's saying, yeah, dog, I really like you. I like you as an artist and you're figuring it out. I don't know that that was my favorite song choice for you, but you worked hard at it and there were some really good parts. I think you're really in this competition. So finding that voice of realism to debate the inner Simon, that's important. And in fact, there's a psychological exercise that does this, and you sort of did it just now. It's called the best friend discussion. Pretend that your best friend came to you and expressed all the anxieties that you're feeling. What would you tell him or her? You'd probably acknowledge the difficulties, and you might even gently point out to your friend some things that he or she did that might help or hinder the situation. But then you would remind your friend of all of her strengths, all of the things she has going for her, and why her inner Simon is not accurate. In short, you'd be her inner Randy. Here's another technique for you to consider. We've discussed some of the potentially negative things legal training does for our psyches, but here's one of the good things it can do. It can teach you to be your own advocate. After all, we're training you to be advocates, and you know that in order to maximize your effectiveness as an advocate, you have to know the other side of your arguments as well as you know your side. When we ask you to do moot court, you write both briefs and you prepare to argue each side with equal fervor. Well, when you're feeling down and you've got that negative vibe, be your own advocate. Use your moot court training and write the opposing brief to your negative thoughts. Think actively about the positives, the reasons that the negative dialogue is wrong. Some of the negative dialogue will be accurate and useful, but the positives will be there too, and that will help you be more balanced and more thoughtful and constructive in your response. Finally, when you know you're going into a challenging situation, one where you're likely to get curveballs and you want to respond well, practice. That will allow you to deploy what psychologist Karen Rivich calls real-time resilience. Dr. Rivich tells a story of preparing to walk into a room full of high-ranking military officers to give them a talk about resilience. All of the insecurities and worries you might imagine were going through her head. These officers wouldn't respect her, they wouldn't be interested in what she had to say, they would ask questions she wouldn't know the answers to, she might freeze up and not deliver her best, and so on. She recommends preparing in advance by taking each of your worries head on, visualizing it, and using one of these sentences to address it. These officers won't be interested in what I have to say. Well, that's not true, because they invited me here to speak and they're in the room. I just have to share what I know. What if they ask a question I don't know the answer to? If that happens, I will slow myself down. I know what feels like years inside my head is only a few seconds to the audience, and it will show that I'm really listening. If I still don't know the answer, I'll admit that and commit to getting an answer, then I'll move on. They won't take me seriously because I'm not in the military and they won't think what I know applies to them. A better way to see this is that I haven't been in the military before, but my research applies to people who suffer setbacks, and that certainly includes them and their soldiers. They think I'm the expert, and you know what? I am. I just have to be ready to ask them for situations that they think of as setbacks and then connect that to what I know. With these skills of real-time resilience, we can overcome the voices in our heads as they happen, and with preparation, we'll know exactly where to go when the voices start talking. So what are the takeaways that we want to make sure you keep in your head? First, like in part one where we said there will always be stress, keep in mind that there will always be setbacks. Life is hard and it presents challenges no matter who you are. Facing these challenges and growing from them is exciting, and it's probably one of the things that drew you to law in the first place. Setbacks are not to be feared, they're to be expected. Designing our optimal response to them is what will make the difference between thriving and struggling. Second, resilience and optimism are skills designed to react to challenges, to stop the downward spiral and change direction, getting back into an upward spiral of broadening and building. The quicker you do that, the quicker you're back on the road to thriving. Third, you're getting formal training at law school in a lot of ways that can help you improve the way you think about challenges and setbacks, and that can counter negativity bias and self-directed skepticism or pessimism. Use realism to advise your clients, but bring optimism to your personal relationships. Be your own advocate and talk yourself through all sides of a situation. Write both briefs and then decide what to follow. And remember real-time resilience. The way you're perceiving things may not be accurate, and preparing for adversity will enhance your reactions to it in the moment.
While today's seminar has been geared to those times when we're not in that crisis state that we described at the outset, it's always important to remember that no matter what emotional state you're in, and no matter what you're struggling with in life, there are people and organizations waiting to hear from you and to help you. For most day-to-day matters, turn to your friends, your family, your colleagues, and your school administrators. One of the great things about our developing awareness of the challenges our profession faces is that we've also developed many resources to help lawyers in crisis, their colleagues, and their families. Here are just a few. And here's a list of signs that signal when you or a colleague may be in crisis, and outreach to one of these resources is essential.
We hope this has been useful for you, and we'd love the chance to hear from you, to respond to questions, or to talk further about these and other applications of positive psychology. Here's our contact information. Please feel free to reach out. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you down the road.